So we've talked about silence, mysticism, contemplation, monasticism. Do you have any questions, or is there anything else just in this general topic of spirituality that might be you'd like for us to reflect on together?
You're saying God is hidden. I don't think God is hidden. I think he's right there in front of us. We don't see him. If I'm taking a walk and I hear the tree, I swear, one Sunday I was walking. It was so quiet. It was like a January day. I would pass a group of trees, and it was like they were saying, "Hello, Gail, how are you?" You know, and then I came back and told Milton, I know you think I'm crazy. He said no. And then another day I saw leaves playing in the street.
Mm-hmm.
So God, I don't think is hidden. It's just that we don't see God.
You know, another quality that I think is really important when we talk about contemplation, and if you look at that definition from the glossary of the Catholic Catechism, it does talk about looking with the eyes of love and adoration. But I like kind of the archaic English word beholding, that we behold the presence of God. And the reason why I say that God is hidden, again, quoting Isaiah, is that I think sometimes in the seasons of our lives, God can seem far away. And so there can be this quality of almost shyness or elusiveness. But I also am totally in agreement with you, Gail. I think this is a paradox, that actually all we have to do is learn to just, well, to use the other analogy here, to listen, but to behold. And that the presence of God is in every one of our eyes. You know, it's in the faces of people who suffer, but it is in joy, it is in the beauty of nature. I think, Richard Rohr talks about going into the grocery store and falling in love with the detergent, And I mean, sometimes, and then Barbara Brown Taylor, here I am name dropping, but Barbara Brown Taylor preached a sermon once where she talked about having kind of a mystical experience cleaning the litter of her kitty cat, Now, I do the litter, all the time, and I haven't, that's not how God chooses to communicate with me. But it does help me to stay very earthy, I guess. But I absolutely, there are, what is it? The world is charged with the grandeur of God. There's such a truth there. But I think it's that learning to listen and learning to behold. Sometimes we have to get out of our own way. And I think that going to that place deeper than the words is a great way to do that. And if we take 20 or 30 minutes in the morning to be intentionally silent, what I believe it does is it trains us to be contemplatives all day long. Contemplation is more than just like centering prayer. And I think centering prayer is great. It's more than just centering prayer or praying the rosary or whatever you might do to intentionally practice your spirituality. It's kind of like, that's kind of like going to the gym to work out. But the point is to, to strengthen your fitness 24 hours a day. And I think it's the same thing, that when we are intentionally silent before the mystery of God, it strengthens our ability to listen for the still small voice throughout the day. Barbara.
It feels like dwelling in the truth of whatever, the essence of whether it's a rock or a tree or a leaf, whatever. I see it in my grandchildren and little ones being able to look into the mystery of things and have such awe. And they seem to be able to teach us. And to me, it feels like that's some of the shift going on in religions. A couple I was with this morning just got back from Ireland and said what spirituality they are feeling there, as far as association perhaps with the Roman Catholic Church as it used to be, not seeing it. The openness to same-sex marriage, openness to being willing to be with what is arriving in this moment, that feels like what is going on much in our world. And that seems to touch the mysticism that you're speaking of.
Yeah. I think that, such an important part of, going back to Karl Rahner, the Christian of the future will be a mystic, is that I think that we are called to be present with where we are here and now. That it's not a spirituality of nostalgia. It's interesting. Doug and I were talking before, the group gathered, about, his work is kind of in evolutionary Christianity. And my work is in, looking at St. Bernard of Clairvaux and Julian of Norwich. So I'm going 500 years in the other direction. But we're really trying to do the same thing, because I think that the mystics, the people we call the mystics, and this maybe begins with Jesus, but maybe even some of the Old Testament prophets and figures from other world religions. The mystics are the people who are ahead of their time. They're like, ahead of the curve in an evolutionary sense. I think Richard Rohr calls Jesus the first non-dualist in the West, and that's there may be one or two Greeks that got there too, but I think that's important. And and the same thing, Julian of Norwich. I think we're still unpacking what she said 600 years later. So I think one of the problems we have with the church today, and I'm not just talking about Catholic or Episcopal or whatever, across the board, is that I think we have a tendency, there's kind of a cult of nostalgia. And we kind of want it to be the way it was 50 years ago. We want it to be the way it was, before the question of, same-sex relationships came up, or before the question of interfacing with other world religions came along, or whatever the issue might be that gets our goat. And then, but no, this is where we are. This is where God has called us to be. We're called to be present here. And, we're called to listen to one another here. And then to try to respond out of that place of compassion and that place of mercy and forgiveness and of building relationship. And I think to the extent that those of us who consider ourselves religious can do that. Another thing we were talking about was that I'm a churchgoer. So I'm spiritual and religious. I'm not spiritual but not religious. I'm spiritual and religious. But when I meet somebody who identifies as spiritual but not religious, the last thing I want to do is tell them they're wrong. I want to be in conversation. I want to listen, because they probably have some way to bless me. And a lot of people who identify as spiritual but not religious, when they hear you're religious, their walls go up. And the reason is because they've been beat up so much by other religious people. We were talking about that too, that the first thing you have to say is, well, look, I'm not here to tell you you're wrong. I'm not here to try to convert you. I'm here to talk to you and to listen to you. And I think that's again, this being present. That's what I'm hearing from what your friends from Ireland are saying, and I think that's such an important thing for all of us. George.
Well, the flip side of this is, you talked about contemplation, about silence, mysticism. How do you use these in the interfaith spirituality? Because that's the flip side of, it's my religion, it's your religion. Interfaith spirituality.
Well, I think. And the term that I really like, and it comes from a man named Wayne Teasdale, who was a Catholic monk, and then he became an academic. He died a few years ago. But he coined the term interspirituality. And I like that. I mean, interfaith dialogue, I think, is important, or interreligious dialogue, you hear that one. But that tends to have more of a cognitive. That's more like theologians getting together and talking. There's a joke, I don't know if there's any truth to this or not, but there's a joke that there was this big conference of like Christians and Buddhists. And on one end of the conference were all the theologians. And so they were issuing their papers and having their debates and their conversations. And then in the other wing of the hall were all the monks and the nuns. So you had the Christian monks and nuns and the Buddhist monks and nuns. And so what they did for the whole conference was they meditated together, and they had silence together. And so by the end of the weekend, so the story goes, the theologians are like all just kind of shaking each other's hands. But the nuns and the monks are all embracing one another, and they're gazing into one another's eyes with love. And I think that's the invitation of interspirituality. This idea, and again, I am a bear of little brain. I cannot figure out all of the theological nuances of Christian theology, Catholic theology, or whatever on the one hand, and then you have the Dharma and all the Buddhist wisdom teachings on the other hand, and and I know there are people out there who are trying to weave it all together or trying to keep it all separated. You find that too. All I know is that when I sit down with, and I'm blessed to have a number of wonderful Buddhist friends, that when I sit down with them and we are able to be silent together, that it's a beautiful thing. And then out of that silence, when we have conversation, it's not a conversation about who's right and who's wrong. It's a conversation about how we can all try to live the most soulful, the most present, the most honest life that we can, which also includes being of service. I'm going to steal a line from Presence. They talk about, we're not about conversion, we're about contribution. Am I quoting you correctly, Doug? Such a beautiful line. And I think that's something that all people of faith can consider. What if we stop trying to figure out who's right and who's wrong? And maybe we can assume that every one of us gets it wrong some of the time. But it's like Ken Wilber, the philosopher, says, nobody is clever enough to be wrong all the time. So we all get it wrong some of the time, and we probably all get it right some of the time. And if we can just bring that humility, good monastic value, if we can bring that humility to our conversations, and we try to listen to one another, and we try to learn from one another. And that doesn't mean that there won't be disagreements. That doesn't mean that there won't be debate. But if that can come out of that place of silence, and that place of respect, and that place of mercy, and kindness, what a world we could weave together. And I think this is the thing that it's interesting because people who tend to do contemplative prayer, in my experience, tend to be interested in interfaith work. It's not 100% across the board, but it just pops up again and again. Look at Thomas Merton, or Bede Griffiths, or Sarah Grant, or Cynthia Bourgeot. A number of these wisdom teachers that are running around. Well, little old me is on the same page because I'm deeply committed to learning from my Muslim friends, or my Buddhist friends, or my Vedantist friends. Not because I want to dilute my identity as a Christian. I find my identity as a Christian is deepened and is enhanced and is made more beautiful when I can have a loving relationship with people whose wisdom tradition is not the same as my own. And I think that there's a lot of hope there, because the alternative, which we saw 14 years ago, is people flying airplanes into buildings, or the craziness that's going on in Syria right now. And don't just blame the Muslims. Christians do it too. Every religion is capable of committing atrocities. And so so I think we need the contemplative stance, because the other alternative is not something we can bear. I think
the silence is praise piece speaks to me when we talk about listening. Because when we're really listening to each other, when I'm listening to you, my mouth is closed. And I am listening for the sake of listening, to be a container for you to empty into me. And so if I'm listening without judgment, there's a love that's cultivated between you and I. And so when you talked about on CNN, the people talking over one another, we're not listening. And so there's no transactional love happening.
It's just competition. I've got my point of view and you've got your point of view, and whichever one shouts the loudest wins. Look at our political landscape. And my friends, pray for all of the candidates, even the ones that you really disagree with. And trust me, there's some that they make my blood boil. Pray for them all, and pray for the people who are listening to them. Because our public conversation is getting very noisy. And the monks, the monks are the true counterculturalists here, because they're the ones that are telling us, sit down and shut up. Sit down and shut up. Listen for the whisper of God, and then listen to one another.
I think it was Dan Merrill who wrote the book Psalms for Praying that coined the terms Friends of Silence, which has allowed some of us to kind of create groups of people from various different theological backgrounds to sit together, in silence. And it reminds me of something I read that said, there may not be a universal theology, but there is a universal experience, of wherever we all go when we are sitting in that silence. And it made me also think, your comments about silence, about another rendition of Be Still and Know That I Am God, which is cease striving and listen. Yeah. Which, as soon as I read that, I thought, oh, what a relief.
And that's actually, that is very close to the original Hebrew. Because if you look at Psalm 46, this is the psalm that Martin Luther used when he wrote, "A mighty fortress is our God." It's a very militaristic psalm. And it's all about God, our champion, our might in battle and all this kind of stuff. And then suddenly it shifts, and the voice of God, "Be still and know that I am God." And again, I'm no scholar, but my understanding from my friends who are rabbis is that the Hebrew basically has the connotation of lay down your arms. Cease your striving, desist. That's the stillness that we're invited into. The stillness of vulnerability, of this willingness to be present, which we were talking about a minute or two ago. And in that place, that undefended place, that's where relationship becomes possible. And that's, and if you think about Jesus and you think about Jesus' message, and I think the important thing about Jesus is his message. And his message, love your enemies, love your neighbors. Was it G.K. Chesterton said, your neighbors and your enemies are often the same people? Love one another. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. So you're not off the hook either. For some of us, that's the hardest of all. To truly, truly love ourselves. Those four, love God, love neighbors, love self, love enemies. I don't know about you, that's a lifetime assignment. Right there. And the reason why I'm into this contemplative prayer and then studying the mystics and hanging out at the monastery and practicing silent prayer is because that helps me in my messy, imperfect way to be just a little bit more loving. And I think that's what really, at the end of the day, really, really matters. I think we have time for one more question, so.
I'm not sure this is a question.
Or a comment, yeah.
Yesterday I read a little comment that comes from our Jewish brothers and sisters. The question was put to an individual, "Do you love me?" Answer, "Of course I love you." "Do you know where my pains are? Where I really hurt?" Answer, "No." "Well, how can you say you love me if you don't know where I hurt?"
So if we really want to follow the teachings of Jesus, then maybe one of the things we have to do is listen to one another. And it's going to be painful, because when we encounter each other's pain.
But just to dwell on that, one of the things that I have over the years been developing is an appreciation for Carl Jung.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, I think it would be very interesting to have a dialogue of some sort between Rana, Jung, and Taya de Chardin, but that's another but Jung, it was very simplistic. He talks about the dreams. And I have a dream group at the Catholic Center at the University, and it was part of this. And it is amazing where that dream group takes people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it literally shifts the ground underneath you.
Yeah.
We don't take time to see the novice there, to see the Christ in our brothers and sisters, much less to realize that he's also within us.
Yeah. Yeah, and listening to your dreams can be such an important doorway into that, again, into that loving yourself. So. Yes, okay.
I was thinking about that line that God is hidden. And I think that what I like about that is that it prompts action. And the action being to seek God. And it says, seek and you shall find. And I believe also that seeking and finding also creates it initiates the relationship with God, which initiates everything. You see what I mean? And I think that once you can sit into that contemplation, you realize maybe it's not hidden, but God is camouflaged.
Oh, I love it.
Because God is hidden in plain sight, camouflaged.
I think it's a deep paradox, the presence and the hiddenness. Again, it's like God is word and God is silence. The paradox is that they're both true and they both go all the way down. But I love your insight that the hiddenness of God, it's almost like sand in our slippers, that encourages us to not rest on our laurels, but to reach out to one another, but then also to the universe, to the mystery. And to seek that presence, which is finding us. It's not that we find God; it's that God has found us.
I love your expression, hidden in plain sight.
That's right.
There you go.
Really
Excellent.
not hidden, but
Yeah.
to us who can't see it,
Yeah.
hidden in plain sight.
And it's always available, so that we, at any moment, we can see it, and we realize it's been there all along.
But I think being present allows you to remove the plank from your eye
Yeah.
to see what's there that you just aren't paying attention to.
Yeah.
It's not that it's not there or hidden.
Yeah.
It's
us.
us.
It's a learning to respond to the call that's already there. Well, my brothers and sisters, thank you so much for this conversation and for being here.
End with a prayer.
Why don't we end with a prayer? So, O you whose first language is silence, help us to listen to the silence within us. Help us to notice the space between the words, between the thoughts, and between the images. Make us available to your still small voice. And then lead us to share your love and your mercy with all those who thirst for you. Joyfully in the name of Christ we pray.